going to die anyway," he said, looking into the eyes of his father, a 78-year-old man who could barely stand without support. His mother, sitting in a wheelchair beside him, began to cry silently, that kind of cry from someone who has no more tears left to shed, just a dry ache that corrodes from within. The two sons left the house that Saturday in July, slammed the door, and never returned. They left their parents alone in a house that smelled of medicine and loneliness, without a dime in their pockets to buy food, without anyone to help change Mr. Antonio's diaper, who had lost the use of his legs after a stroke. What these sons didn't know, what they couldn't even imagine as they turned their backs on their own parents, like disposable trash, was that beneath that appearance of poverty and abandonment lay a secret kept for 40 years, a secret worth exactly $2,300,000. If you've ever felt the pain of being rejected by someone you loved your whole life, of being treated like a burden, like a nuisance, like someone worthless just because they've aged or fallen ill, this story will stir every fiber of your being. Because what happened to Mr. Antonio and Mrs. Marta isn't just about money, it's about stolen dignity, about love thrown away, and about a twist so powerful it will make you rethink everything you know about family, justice, and the weight of the choices we make. Before I continue this story, I have a simple request. If you enjoy listening to real stories that touch the heart and make us reflect on what truly matters in life, subscribe to this channel. Every week we bring you stories like this about people who have gone through situations you might be experiencing yourself right now and who found strength where no one expected. Your subscription helps me continue to bring these stories, and I promise each one will be worth your time. The house was in a modest neighborhood on the outskirts of a mid-sized American city, on a street where the houses were packed together and the sounds of neighbors bled through thin walls like paper. It was an old build with those wooden windows painted a faded green, rusted bars, and an iron gate that creaked every time someone pushed it. The backyard was small, just a patch of packed dirt, where Mrs. Marta used to grow collard greens and bitter melon, but now it was overgrown with weeds because she no longer had the strength to care for anything. The smell inside the house was a mix of mildew, diaper rash cream, alcohol, and that characteristic odor of a place where sick people spend all day without leaving. The walls had moisture stains that looked like maps of non-existent countries. The living room sofa was one of those old ones, with brown fabric worn thin on the arms, and the small television in the corner was on all day at a low volume, as if it were just background noise to soften the heavy silence. Mr. Antonio was 78 years old, his face etched by a lifetime of manual labor, the kind of face that seemed sculpted by time, with deep wrinkles around his eyes and a poorly done white beard, because no one helped him shave properly anymore. His eyes were brown and carried a sadness that went far beyond his illness. It was the sadness of someone abandoned by those they loved most. Mrs. Marta was 76, her hair completely white, pulled back in a loose bun, her hands trembling and swollen from arthritis, and a gaze that still held a stubborn sweetness despite everything. She spent her days in her wheelchair trying to do something useful, folding a towel, organizing her medications on the side table, anything to feel like she still served a purpose in this world. The two of them had built that life together, brick by brick, cent by cent, sacrificing everything for their children. Mr. Antonio had been a construction worker his entire life, the kind of guy who woke up at 5 in the morning and came home at 7 at night with calloused hands, a sore back, and the smell of concrete ingrained in his skin. Mrs. Marta had worked as a housekeeper in 3 different homes for 30 years, washing, ironing, cooking, taking care of other people's children while leaving her own children home alone after school. They had 2 sons, Rick and Mike. Rick was the older one, 52, worked as a store manager for a shoe chain, and was married to a woman named Debbie, who had a sharp tongue and a perpetually suspicious look. Mike was 48, a used car salesman, divorced, and lived with a new girlfriend who changed every couple of years. The two sons grew up in that cramped house, ate the rice and eggs their mother made when money ran out before the end of the month, wore clothes their father bought from street vendors, went to public school, and always heard the same lecture from their parents. "We're doing all this for you. One day you'll have a better life than ours." And they did, at least materially. Rick managed to finish high school and get a steady job, moved up the ladder, bought a car, rented an apartment in a better neighborhood. Mike was always a bit more laid back, but he also managed to get by, always had some cash in his pocket, always had an excuse not to help his parents. The relationship began to crack when Mr. Antonio had his first stroke 3 years ago. He was climbing a ladder to change a light bulb when his head started spinning, his left arm locked up, and his whole body collapsed like an imploded building. Martha was in the backyard and heard the crash. She ran inside and found her husband on the floor, his mouth twisted, his eyes wide with panic. She called her sons, cried on the phone, begged them to come quickly. Ricardo arrived 2 hours later, complaining about traffic. Mauricio didn't even show up, saying he was closing an important deal and couldn't leave. At the hospital, the doctors explained that Mr. Antonio had lost a lot of movement on his left side, that he would need physical therapy, constant care, and expensive medication. Ricardo listened to all of it with a look that suggested he was calculating the cost, and before his father was even discharged, he dropped the line Martha would never forget. "Mum, you know I can't afford all this, right?" From then on, life became a silent nightmare. Martha took care of her husband alone, lifting him from bed with a strength she didn't know she had, bathing him, changing his diapers, preparing pureed food because he had trouble swallowing. Their combined pensions came to $1,400, and Mr. Antonio's medication alone cost over $600. What was left was meager for food, electricity, water, and gas. The sons helped, but always reluctantly, always with an air of doing a colossal favor. Ricardo deposited $200 a month and sent messages demanding an accounting for every cent. "Mum, what are you spending it on? $200 isn't nothing." Mauricio would show up once a month with a bag of groceries, stay for 10 minutes, complain about the smell of the house, and leave. Martha started having crying fits, the kind that come in the dead of night, when her husband was asleep and the silence of the house amplified every bad thought. She stared at the cracked ceiling and wondered where she had gone wrong, what she had done so terrible to deserve this. She had spent her whole life giving, sacrificing everything, and now that she needed it, her sons treated her and her husband like a burden. The last straw came on a Friday, July 15th, last year. Martha had fallen in the bathroom trying to help her husband shower, hitting her knee hard on the floor, and could no longer walk properly. She called Ricardo, her voice choked with pain. "Son, I need help. I fell and can't even walk." Ricardo huffed on the other end of the line, said he couldn't come that day because he had an important work meeting. She called Mauricio, same story. He was traveling for work, wouldn't be back until Monday. Martha couldn't walk for 3 days, dragging herself around the house, tending to her husband on her knees, crying from pain and humiliation. On Sunday, she managed to crawl to the gate and ask for help from the neighbor, an older woman named Mrs. Lords, who was the only person who still showed any compassion for that abandoned elderly couple. Mrs. Lords helped her get to the health clinic, waited hours in line, and got her a referral to an orthopedic specialist. When Ricardo finally showed up on Monday, Martha's knee was bruised, swollen, and she had a doctor's note saying she would need a wheelchair for at least 3 months. Ricardo exploded, said it was nonsense, that his mother needed to be more careful, that he couldn't afford to be footing these bills. Mauricio arrived half an hour later, heard his brother complaining, and agreed with everything. "Yeah, Mum, you really need to take better care of yourself. We can't keep dropping everything to solve your problems." It was that day the two brothers had that conversation in the kitchen, while Martha pretended not to hear from the living room. They spoke in low tones, but the hatred in their words cut through the thin walls. Ricardo said, "I can't take this anymore, man. It's something new every day, a new expense every month. I have my own family to support." Mauricio replied, "And I have my own life too."
"I'm not going to become a slave to sick old people, bro." Ricardo then dropped the line that would change everything. "Look, let's be honest. They're old. They're sick. This will be over any day now. We have to stop draining our money on this." Mauricio laughed, a cynical laugh, and added, "Yeah, at least when they dies, we can sell this house, split the money, and go our separate ways."
They talked a little longer, did some calculations, discussed how much the house might be worth, maybe 180 zone dollars, $90,000 each. They thought it was a good deal. They left the kitchen, went to the living room where their parents were. Mr. Antonio lay on the sofa, his gaze lost on the ceiling. Martha sat in her wheelchair, her hands trembling in her lap. Ricardo stood in front of them and said, with a coldness that froze the air, "Look, Dad, Mum, we can't keep supporting you anymore. We have our lives, our expenses, and you'll have to manage with your pensions." Mr. Antonio tried to speak, but his twisted mouth only let out a muffled sound. Martha managed to whisper, "But son, how will we manage?" Mauricio then leaned down, looked his mother in the eyes and said, almost a whisper, but with a venom that burned her soul, "You're going to die anyway. It's just a matter of time. Stop being so dramatic." He stood up. Ricardo was already heading for the door, and the two of them left. The door slammed shut, and the echo of that sound lingered in the empty house for days. Donna Marta froze, her mind struggling to process what she had just heard. "You're going to die anyway." The words echoed in her head like a death sentence. She looked at her husband, tears streaming down his face, and felt the floor drop out from under her wheelchair. That night, she didn't sleep. She lay awake, staring at the closed door, waiting for her sons to return, to knock, to apologize, to say it was just a moment of anger. But no one came back. Days turned into weeks. No calls. No texts. No sign of life. Her pension check arrived on the 10th, and by the 15th it was gone. Donna Marta rationed their food, making a pot of soup that lasted 3 days. She stopped buying meat, sticking to rice, beans and eggs. The gas ran out, so she switched to a makeshift alcohol stove. Mr. Antonio's medication ran out, and she went to the clinic, practically begging for doses, crying in front of the receptionist until she got at least half of what he needed. Mr. Antonio worsened, developing a fever, groaning in pain at night, and Donna Marta would just sit there, helpless, wiping his forehead with a damp cloth, praying to God to take him quickly if it was meant to be. The electricity and water bills were overdue. A shut-off notice arrived. Donna Marta went to the utility company, asked for a payment plan, and was denied. They went to social services, filled out forms, and waited for hours in a line of desperate people. They managed to get a food basket and a promise that someone would visit their home to assess the situation, but no one ever showed up. Donna Lourdes, the neighbor, started bringing them meals secretly, not wanting her husband to know she was helping. He always said everyone should mind their own business. She'd leave the meals at the door, knock, and leave quickly. Donna Marta would open the door, see the food, and weep with gratitude, the kind of tears from someone who no longer felt they had a right to exist. 3 months passed, 3 months of loneliness, hunger, pain, and despair. Antonio had another stroke, a minor one, but enough to leave him even weaker, barely able to speak. Donna Marta realized he was dying, not from the strokes, but from sadness. He had given up. He stopped trying to speak, stopped reacting when she talked to him, spent his days staring at the wall as if waiting for death to come and take him once and for all. She tried to cheer him up, saying, "Honey, we'll be okay, I promise. We've always managed, and we'll manage again." But she didn't believe it herself anymore. It was on a Tuesday, October 17th, that everything changed. Donna Marta was sitting in her wheelchair next to her husband, both in silence, when there was a knock at the door. She wasn't expecting anyone. She thought it might be Donna Lourdes, but it was too early. She wheeled herself to the door, opened it, and saw a man in a suit, around 40, with a leather briefcase, a polite smile on his face. He asked, "Are you Marta Silva?" She confirmed, suspicious. He continued, "My name is Dr. Renato, I'm an attorney, and I'm here to discuss a matter concerning a property registered in the name of Mr. Antonio Silva." Donna Marta frowned, confused. Property? What property? The lawyer asked if he could come in, and she let him, still not quite understanding what was happening. He sat on the edge of the sofa, opened his briefcase, took out some documents, and began to explain. He said that a plot of land in the interior of Minas Gerais, in the city of Patos de Minas, which Mr. Antonio had bought in 1982, had been expropriated by the government for the construction of a highway. Donna Marta didn't understand any of it. Land expropriation, the lawyer continued, explaining that the compensation process had taken years, gone through various judicial levels, but had finally concluded. He then opened a document, pointed to a number, and said, "The compensation for the land with adjustments, interest, and everything else totals 2,347,000 reis." Donna Marta's vision went dark. She thought she had misheard. She asked him to repeat. He repeated, this time more slowly, 2,347,000 reis, ma'am. She looked at her husband, who had also heard and had wide eyes, his mouth agape, unable to process the information. Friends, can you imagine what it's like to spend 3 months thinking you're going to die of hunger, abandonment, and despair, and then suddenly discover you have over $2 million? But the story doesn't end there, because what Donna Marta felt at that moment wasn't relief. It was anger, a deep, visceral rage she didn't even know existed within her. She asked the lawyer, "And how is it that we didn't know about this?" He explained that the notices had been sent to their old address, that the case had proceeded without their input, but that the law guaranteed the right to compensation regardless. He said they just needed a few signatures, some updated documents, and the money would be deposited into Mr. Antonio's account within 15 days. Donna Marta thanked him, signed everything with a trembling hand, and when the lawyer left, she stood there, frozen, staring at the closed door. Mr. Antonio made a sound. She looked at him and saw in his eyes the same thing she was feeling. It wasn't happiness. It was a thirst for justice. That night, for the first time in months, they talked. Mr. Antonio had difficulty speaking, but she understood every slurred word, every fought-for syllable. He said, his voice trembling and his mouth crooked, "Don't tell them." Donna Marta nodded. They wouldn't tell. Their sons had said they were going to die anyway, that it was only a matter of time, that they were waiting to sell the house and split the money. Well, they were about to find out they were wrong. In the following weeks, Donna Marta transformed. She started making calls, researching, planning. She discovered she needed legal help to protect the money, to ensure her sons couldn't touch it. She found a lawyer, explained the situation, and he set up an asset protection plan, creating a will that clearly stated Ricardo and Mauricio would not receive a single cent. She also contacted a social worker, reported the abandonment, documenting everything, every text message from her sons complaining every time they refused help. If this story is resonating with you, imagine what's coming next. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any stories like this. Here, we tell real stories of people who faced the impossible, and I'm sure many of them will make you feel less alone on your journey. Tell me in the comments, have you ever been in a situation where you felt the ground disappear from under your feet? Have you ever had that moment when the person you trusted most disappointed you in a way you never imagined? Write, "I've been there" below if this story touched you in any way. Your comment might be exactly the message someone else needed to read today to know they're not alone. The money hit the account on November 5th. Mrs. Marta asked the bank manager to transfer it all to a separate savings account, far from any access by her sons. She didn't touch the money, didn't buy anything, didn't change anything in her routine. She continued living the same way, with the same simple food, the same crumbling house, the same old clothes. She wanted her sons to keep thinking her parents were starving. And they did. Ricardo called once, in December, asked if everything was okay, and Mrs. Marta said it was, but her voice sounded tired, defeated, exactly as he expected to hear. He hung up, satisfied. Maurizio showed up for Christmas, stayed 5 minutes, left a box of cheap fruitcake, and left. Neither of them noticed anything had changed, but Mrs. Marta had changed. Inside, she had stopped being that mother who begged for crumbs of attention. She had become someone else, someone who finally understood that love isn't an obligation, that family isn't blood, it's a choice. And her sons had chosen money. On January 15th of this year, Mrs. Marta decided it was time. She called Ricardo, asked him and his brother to come over, said she had something important to tell them. Ricardo was suspicious, thought his mother was going to ask for money again, but agreed to go, mostly to get it over with. Mauricio came too, complaining he had better things to do. They arrived together on a Saturday afternoon, walked into the house with that disgusted, hurried look, like they wanted to resolve it quickly and leave. They sat on the sofa. Mrs. Marta was in her wheelchair, Mr. Antonio beside her, lying down but awake, attentive. Ricardo immediately said, "So, Mum, what do you want?" Mrs. Marta took a deep breath, looked at her 2 sons and said, in a calm voice that surprised even herself, "I wanted to let you know that your father and I have made a decision. We're moving out of this house." Ricardo frowned. "Moving? To where?" Mrs. Marta replied, "We bought a bigger, accessible house in a better neighborhood. We've also hired 2 caregivers to stay with us full-time." Mauricio let out a laugh, thinking his mother had completely lost it. "Bought a house? With what money, Mum?" Mrs. Marta didn't look away. "With the settlement money for your father's land, $2,300,000. The silence that fell in the room was so heavy it felt like the air had turned to concrete. Ricardo went pale, his mouth hanging open, unable to form a word. Maurizio jumped up. "What land? What settlement? You're lying." Mrs. Marta took a paper from the bag hanging on her wheelchair and handed it to him. "I'm not lying. It's all here. We received the money in November, and before you think anything, know that we've already protected everything. There are lawyers, a will, everything is registered. You won't see a cent of this money." Ricardo exploded. "What do you mean we won't see any? That money is ours too. We're your children." Mrs. Marta then said, each word carrying the weight of 40 years of sacrifice, "You said we were going to die anyway, remember? You said it was just a matter of time. You turned your backs on us when we needed you most. So now you'll get what you always wanted. We will die one day, like everyone else. But when that happens, you won't inherit anything. Because we've decided that this money will go to those who truly took care of us. It will go to Mrs. Lords, our neighbour, who brought us food when you left us starving. It will go to the social worker who helped us. It will go to charities that care for abandoned seniors. You will have nothing. And you know what? We don't want you here anymore. This house is still ours, and we want you to leave and never come back. Mauricio tried to argue, yelled, cursed, called his mother ungrateful, said they were the ones who raised their parents, as if the roles had been reversed. Ricardo cried, not from sadness, but from anger, from frustrated greed, from realizing he had lost a fortune by being a miserable son. Mrs. Marta remained unfazed. She asked them to leave, said if they didn't, she'd call the police. They left, cursing, slamming the door, vowing to sue, but they knew they had no chance. When the door closed, Mrs. Marta looked at her husband. Mr. Antonio smiled for the first time in months, a crooked but genuine smile. She held his hand and they both cried, but this time it wasn't tears of pain, it was tears of liberation. 2 months later, Martha and Antonio moved into their new home. It was a spacious single-story house with a ramp at the entrance, adapted bathrooms and large rooms with windows that let in the morning sun. They hired 2 wonderful caregivers, Jessica and Patricia, 2 young women who treated them with a tenderness they had forgotten existed. Martha had her knee surgery and was able to walk again, slowly, with a cane, but she was walking. Antonio started physical therapy at home. He improved a bit, never fully returning to his old self, but he regained some speech, some mobility, and, most importantly, his will to live. They began to receive visits from Lords, who now came over for coffee every week, and the 2 elderly friends would laugh about silly things and talk about their favorite TV shows. Martha created a small garden in the backyard of their new home, planting roses, basil, and lettuce. She was back to tending the soil, something she loved and had abandoned for so long. Antonio spent his afternoons sitting on the porch, watching the birds, sipping fresh orange juice, and listening to the newspaper that Jessica read aloud to him. They discovered that growing old doesn't have to be synonymous with abandonment. That dignity isn't a luxury, it's a right. That true love doesn't come from blood, it comes from choice. Ricardo and Mauricio tried to reconnect, tried to apologize, but their apologies were hollow, driven by regret over losing money, not by regret over abandoning their parents. Martha was clear she forgave them because holding on to resentment harms the soul, but she no longer wanted contact. She told them to go live their lives and that she and Antonio would live theirs. The sons disappeared. They never called again. They never showed up again. And you know what? Martha realized she didn't miss them. The peace she felt now was worth more than any illusion of family. She had learned, in the most painful way possible, that not everyone who calls you Mom deserves to be called son. If this story touched your heart in any way, I implore you from the bottom of my heart, please subscribe to the channel. Here, we don't just tell stories. We create a space where real people share real pain and find comfort in knowing they are not alone. Every subscription helps me continue this work, and I promise that every week you'll find a story here that will make you reflect, cry, smile, and above all, feel understood. And before you go, do me a favor, write one word in the comments, just one, that summarizes what you felt listening to this story. It could be hope, it could be strength, it could be pain. It doesn't matter what it is, because every comment down below becomes a chain of support for someone who might be going through the worst phase of their life and needs to know that people care. Write, "This story moved me," if you felt something. Thank you so much for staying with me until the end. It means more than you can imagine. Leave your like if this story resonated with you, and I'll see you in the next story. I'll be waiting for you here.